So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Just a few ground rules, I guess. If everyone could just have their mics turned off and the cameras turned off as well, just kind of reduce any server load, that'd be awesome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So these webinars, our webinars are just about being working class in clinical psychology and just in psychology in general, so not just working with a clinical population, even in terms of research as well, and kind of how that intersects as well with other factors, so things like mental health or physical health, disabilities as well. So that's kind of what these webinars are about. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Monza, and he's going to carry on from there.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've been to one of these things before. If you haven't, welcome. And yeah, just in terms of the structure, we'll normally just go through our speakers. They'll talk for about 15 minutes, after which we'll take questions from you guys for about 10 minutes. So just type away in the thing at the side. We really want to see that. And yeah, today's subject is about the intersection between being working class and mental health. We know that in this country, I think the poorest 20% are about 2 or 3 times more likely to have issues with their mental health. And I guess thinking about the pandemic, the fact we've got unemployment at its highest for 5 years, and the effect that has, you know, it's quite a big thing, isn't it? Even just outside of, like, say, a career path of being a clinical psychologist, it's quite a wide thing. I think the first speaker we've got is Chelsea. So, Chelsea, let's hand over to you. You can introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Chelsea and I'm a first year trainee at Sheffield. Monza, I don't know if you want me to just pause and introduce first or just again, I don't know what the plan
Yeah, no, just go for it.
Yeah, all right. So yeah, I'm of course very new to everything. I'm my first year, first placement on the doctorate, and yeah, like I say, it's all very new. I actually got on a reserve place, so I think it was 9th reserve actually, and I got on with the extra funded places as well. So yeah, sort of just to say, you know, you can get on from being in a reserve as well. So I guess today I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experiences and where I'm from and my journey, and just think about some of the challenges I faced during that, but also some of the positives I've took from it as well. So I was born and raised in Bradford in West Yorkshire, and if anybody knows Bradford, it's quite a deprived area, especially in some parts more than others. And yeah, I sort of moved around a lot as a young person, I suppose, moving house, moving schools. I guess I'd say that I didn't really have a true sense of home growing up, and there were some difficult experiences when I was younger. So yeah, from the age of about 10 years old, I lived with my grandma, and my grandma was very working class. You know, she was out at work every day, and you know, I guess it was drilled into me to just work. I sort of spent lots of time with childminders through high school, and yeah, I didn't really become aware that I had any mental health difficulties, I suppose, until I started my undergraduate degree, which was at Liverpool John Moores. So I sort of started that degree, and that's when I started to notice there were sort of peaks and troughs in my journey, and perhaps at times I was more impacted by things more than others. And I guess that's when I went to the GP and said, oh, I think something's going on here. But at that point, I wasn't really sure whether I wanted to admit that I was struggling myself. My route into psychology, I started out, like I said, in Liverpool, and then I did a master's at Leeds, health psychology master's, and then I actually moved around a lot. And I'll talk a little bit about the challenges I faced with that, but I sort of moved my first assistant role to Oxfordshire, and then I moved back to an NHS role in Halifax, and now I'm in Sheffield, so I've been moving around a lot again. There's a couple of themes I wanted to share, and I guess the main one for me, given my sort of experiences, is my sort of sense of identity and belonging, and the profession in general. I suppose I think when I started out in psychology, I had this sort of sense of being quite different to other people, and I didn't know what that was about at the time. It was like the really small things for me that I picked up on. So, you know, I was working with all these psychologists who were really sort of well groomed and, you know, had the money for the hair and the nails doing, and they came across as sort of being in a quite stable place. And for me, you know, I was financially not that stable, and also I guess just felt in a different place of life, and I didn't know whether that was to do with, of course, my mental health or just the way I was brought up and my working class nature, I suppose. Thinking a bit more about mental health as well, I felt quite shameful of having mental health difficulties. I thought to be a clinical psychologist, you had to be perfect. You could never be ill. And I was just really ashamed. I didn't want to tell anybody about it. And I think there were times at work when I used to say I was physically unwell instead of mentally stressed, because I was too scared to admit it to somebody. And it just made me feel really incompetent. I think there was one point where I actually accessed a service that was very similar to the service I was working in. And I was thinking, how could someone possibly help people if they're also struggling themselves? That this just doesn't happen. And so, yeah, so I guess that shame was a big thing for me. And I guess another thing, sort of being working class as well, is the family support around me sort of throughout my journey. So I guess the biggest thing was maybe them not knowing how difficult the course was for me. You know, I've got part of my family that are working, and I've got part of my family who don't work. You know, I was brought up on a council estate, and half my family still don't work. So there's sort of like, they didn't understand the pressure of being at university, doing the work I was doing. And for me, I just felt quite alone in having that family sort of support or sort of understanding what I was going through. And yeah, the other barrier for me was sort of the financial things as well. You know, whilst I was doing my masters, I think at one point I was doing 3 jobs. I was like part-time with one company, part-time with another company. And yeah, I was obviously trying to manage a master's degree, but at the same time, I had to fund my living, and I had to fund, you know, everything, my life. And I think over the years, I've sort of got myself a bit, I guess I've got an overdraft, and I think now you think, right, I'm in a position where I'm on this doctorate and I'm getting paid a certain amount of money, but actually for me, because of the journey I've been on, I'm still sort of paying back them things that I've had to do, like, you know, take out an overdraft to support myself. And yeah, just moving around again, like the nature of the profession, sort of the need to move around to gain experiences. I think that's where the intersection comes in, because I think moving around has impacted on my mental health as well, like more so that sort of sense of belonging. And, you know, like now in Sheffield, you know, my family are in Bradford and there's nobody around me. I don't have that support network, I suppose. So yeah, it's just thinking about the impact of moving around for me. So I'll talk through a bit now some of the positives, because it's not all sort of barriers. Like, that's some of my sort of the main themes and reflections that came up. But I think overall, I think my experiences have just really enabled me to take more time for myself, you know, my own self-care, and actually being around different people from different backgrounds. It's sort of given me role models in a way, thinking about how I develop sort of healthy boundaries for myself, and, you know, what I what I might want to do differently. And I actually think I can really empathise with clients more, and just bring that real authenticity and warmth when, you know, they're talking through some of these struggles that they're going through. You know, a lot of them I can sort of relate to, and I guess it's getting that balance of not over-identifying as well, but yeah, just being quite warm and authentic when I'm working with people. And I think just naturally, my nature, like I say, when Anne brought me up, she was very sort of working and driven, and that's how I am. You know, I've always been, that drive and that independence has really helped me in this career, and sort of challenge things. You know, sometimes services can do things in a certain way, and I guess I'm always that person who's sort of challenging what's happening and bringing a new creative mind, I suppose, to a service. And yeah, and actually, you know, I've been in therapy myself, so it's really helped me to notice things that are helpful in professionals and things that maybe are less helpful. And, you know, that of course helps me as a training psychologist as well, to how I approach sessions. And I think generally it's just allowed me to be more sort of reflective, develop awareness of my own sort of triggers, and think about how that influences sessions with clients. And yeah, I think it's really, over time I've started to reach out more to people, and you realise actually, like now my cohort at Sheffield, I started talking about being working class for the first time, and there was like 4 people on my course who had a similar background, and I was like, wow, you know, before I'd have sat there thinking I'm all alone and very different to everyone else, but then actually when you start having conversations like what we're doing today, you realise how many people who do have different experiences, and it's just nice to share that, I suppose. I'm wrapping up now. I'm aware of time, but there's a few sort of ending messages I just wanted to get across. I feel like now I've sort of had conversations around my mental health, it's really helped me at university as well. Like on the Sheffield course now, I've got like a disability support plan, and you know, when I am feeling stressed and struggling, then I can get the help and support that I need, just like somebody who has a physical disability might need. And yeah, I just started to feel less shameful about how, you know, how I am. And I think it's about taking them really small steps, because it can be scary to do that. But, you know, if you just reach out to one person and take it small, and then you sort of, my journey has just been building that up. And I think sort of developing that, for me, developing that new sense of identity, what's integrating sort of what I call 2 different worlds, it can take time. And, you know, if you do feel like that, then, you know, you're not alone, and it can be a process of sort of discovering yourself and, you know, everything else that comes with it. And just, I think it's really easy to not be compassionate toward yourself, and, you know, I can be my own self-critic at times. So I'm just trying to learn to apply the things that I suggest to others, and just be a bit more compassionate to myself. And I guess the final word is, you know, you can struggle with your mental health at times, but you can still be great at your job, and that's okay. I guess it's just about recognising and becoming self-aware of what you need when you feel in a certain way, you know, and sort of working with that. So I will leave it there and leave some room for questions.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Chelsea. And we've just got some questions for you. Both Ben and Lauren are asking, just wondering how you've been able to look after yourself. What's worked for you?
I actually think that the reaching out, because like I say, now I've got a plan in place that if I do need extensions, I can get them easier, you know. And I think you've just got to take extra time. It sounds like self-care and all that stuff, you know, you hear it all the time, but I've just started to do a lot more things for myself, like my hobbies, and really develop them. I think there were a stage from school. I went from school where I were into everything, sports, music, you know, everything. And then I had a few years where I did absolutely nothing for myself. So I think over the past year or so, I've just really started to reconnect with some of those things.
Okay, and we've got, oh, sorry, you go, Julie.
I was just going to say another question for you in the chat. How do you manage your workload whilst at work?
How do I manage my workload? Oh, that's a good question. To be honest, I just I have a colour-coded diary. I like to organise things. And how do I manage it? I think I'm just very sort of, I use supervision to its best, you know, as much as possible. And yeah, if I feel overwhelmed or something, if it's getting too much, I guess I've started just to be really open about that. And equally when I'm sort of underwhelmed and need more work, because I think, you know, there's the mental health and there's the background. I'm quite driven as well. So sometimes it's me also saying, I need more work to keep me well, because if I feel too underwhelmed, that might also make me not feel like I've got the purpose. And so, yeah.
Yeah, we got another question from Rebecca. She says, do you share details of your own difficulties with people you work with? And if that's possible, how can you do that in a safe way?
It depends who you mean. I mean, because there's like people on the cohort and there's placement staff and staff on the course. I've shared it with the course, and everyone has for people who might not be aware, you have a clinical tutor at uni who you can sort of share how things are generally for you. So I guess it's just like anything, I developed that relationship with my tutor, which then allowed me to share. And yeah, similar, I think it's just the people who you feel close to, just start small, maybe just share it with one person, see how you feel about that. And I think having more positive responses can give you that courage to be more open with other people. Because I guess I just used to think, oh no, they're going to think I can't do my job and all this, but then actually I opened up once to say to a supervisor, and there was just really sort of helpful and supportive, and I think that can, you know, be huge.
Thank you for that, Chelsea. I've just got a comment here from Laura. So she really appreciates you taking the time to share this with us, and it's really validating to hear some of the things, to hear that she shares some things in common in terms of her own experiences. So Laura's question is, so Laura's wondering if you found support in other areas when family haven't always understood, especially seeing as you've moved around quite a bit.
So the question is, have I got support? How have I got support?
Yeah, in other areas, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to be really open and say I've had support from like workplace wellbeing services, university, counselling services, you know, through the GP. I guess I've just, you know, done what I need to do in terms of reaching out to professionals, I suppose. So I'm getting a bit lost with the question now.
Yeah, just other supports apart from families, especially if, you know, there are times when they haven't understood or when you've moved away. So moved away from kind of like that family support. But yeah.
Yeah, when I was away from home. Yeah, I think it was difficult for me. I tried to develop friendships as best I could to support me through that, and I think Luckily, when I moved away to Oxfordshire, I had a really supportive team who started to, I started to do a lot of just PPD specific supervision, which allowed me to talk through some of these difficult things, that I had going on. So yeah, I guess that's what I've done. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think it does. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you. There's a few more questions, but I've lost where I'm at now.
Yeah, I think this next one is, I'm just trying to summarize it. Do you think being working class can stop people from disclosing their lived experience in a way that might help the people they work with?
Sorry, you cut off there. What was the end part?
Sorry, so we've got a comment here from Mirabai, and they've kind of mentioned that maybe when psychologists bring up their own lived experience, that can sometimes be really helpful to the people they're working with. And I think they're just asking about that intersection of being working class, and does that feel kind of harder to disclose?
So to clients?
Yeah.
It's a tricky one because I haven't necessarily disclosed to clients my lived experience. I've sort of, talked about having difficult experiences as a human being, like we all do. But I guess it's, people have different opinions on disclosing that to a client. But I'm not sure really.
Sorry, someone's just asked, do you ever notice barriers to empathizing with people from different class backgrounds? So like Boris Johnson was in the session with you.
Interestingly, actually, I'm writing up a case presentation of a case report of a lady I've just been working with, who's an older lady, and I think she did disclose a sort of class, and it was very different to mine. And I guess in that situation there wasn't much of a barrier to it, and I've not really experienced that yet. Because I think in most circumstances with people I've worked with have been in sort of difficult situations financially and are from areas that are more deprived, and that might just be from the services I've worked in. But yeah, I've not really come across any main barriers as to yet, but it'd be really, like, it's the start of my journey, and it's definitely something to think about and reflect on going through. And yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Chelsea. Lots of comments in the comment part, just saying thank you for sharing tonight, and how people really kind of relate to a lot of the things that you're talking about and you're saying. So thank you so much for taking time out today, and thank you for answering the question.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker for today, and that's Natalie. So I'm going to let Natalie introduce herself, because you're going to do so much better than I will.
Hi there. Hi, my name's Natalie Kemp. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I have lived experience of mental health difficulties myself. And I'm the founder of Integrate Mental Health, where we offer one-to-one and group peer support for mental health professionals with lived experience. And the very fact that we exist tells everybody a lot about why, because it's so difficult. And I loved, thank you, Chelsea, I loved some of the themes that you brought up, because they're things that I can identify with myself, and a lot of things that a lot of other people can really struggle with. I'm also talking to you as a white middle class woman in this forum talking about class. So I'm really interested in where we have issues of intersectionality, where we can, lots of different things about our social and political selves can come together and either enable or disable us within the systems that we work in and within our society. So I have some inherent structural privileges from being white and from being middle class, which I am very aware of. And I have experienced some really big disadvantages from being somebody who's had mental health difficulties, which have had wider impacts on how I'm able to live my life, and all of the things that you might think I'm privileged with because of being middle class actually kind of get very much changed very quickly when I was very poorly. So I use the word poorly. Lots of people use lots of different words, and I know there are many different languages around when we talk about mental health difficulties. I guess from my point of view, what's really interesting to me is how layers and layers of disadvantage can build up to mean that people can be more and more excluded from a profession that has got loads wrong, to put it mildly, and in a very brief kind of encapsulated way. And from my experience of going through clinical psychology and breaking down as a clinical psychologist in 2015, when I did, and all that I experienced around that, gave me a very sudden and disturbing insight into structurally how much needs to be changed within not only the clinical psychology scene, but but wider. There are some really important themes that Chelsea brought up that I want to kind of dive into, because I think, I know that she's very much not alone with those. And those are themes of questioning identity and belonging, themes of shame, and this excellent one that comes up for everybody, which has got far too big for its boots, which is this idea of incompetency when you struggle with your mental health. So we have a clinical psychology system that is structured around white middle class females in its majority, and the minority of males actually, but males were overrepresented in very senior positions, which is interesting about why maleness has coalesced at the top end. And so we think about all sorts of things within that. And when you are somebody who feels as if you don't fit against those kind of structurally privileged positions that we're used to seeing in clinical psychology, you're going to be working double time to feel as if you need to prove something about your lovely self in order to feel fit for purpose for a scene that doesn't seem to represent you, and in which you can't see yourself. So that's already taking a certain amount of energy, really, to feel that you can find the courage to do that. And also structurally, what are the barriers to access to even going through all these assistant psychologist posts or these pre-qualification posts that you have before even being able to get a look in, at the interview. And what do you bring to those interviews, and how much do you say about yourself and your history? And certainly any history of lived experience of mental health difficulties, it's really hard. And the shame is something that I formulate as belonging to the systems and the organisations around us, and not something that belongs to the individual when it comes to any of these differences, but certainly lived experience of mental health difficulties. Systems and organisations don't like vulnerability. They're not very good at it. It's very unpalatable, and they'd rather cast it out or split it off. But of course, people like me who have lived experience of mental health difficulties physically embody the things that get cast out and split off. So when we fall by the wayside, as it can feel, you're really falling. You feel as if you're falling out of the system, as if you wouldn't be allowed to call yourself a clinical psychologist anymore. And this is something that I've railed against for a very long time, and why I got so involved with the British Psychological Society to put a statement out there about valuing lived experience and how common it is, of course, for all of us humans in the system to have lived experience. And also there's some work that we did for training courses as well. And what's really important about it is a systems view, because sure, as an individual, you might need some support around certain things. I needed support for my personal pain. I've been in therapy for a long time because I needed it, not just as an experiment, before I came on the course, in fact. And so that's your personal pain that people have lived lives, all of us have lived lives, so we have our journeys. And then when you're in a system and you break down, what seems to happen, we notice at Integrate when we're working with people and looking into this, is there's this extra layer of provider mental health stigma, I call it, this extra layer of weight that seems to be carried by people extremely unfairly, because they represent a vulnerability in the system then that the system doesn't like. The system can like to be quite mechanised, task focused, get on with it. The NHS is stretched, people need to be performing targets, all the time, these things. And when we have any kind of difficulties, physical or mental health difficulties, we can become something that's difficult. And for all the sense that the mental health scene feels as if it knows how to manage mental health difficulties, even if it did, which it's still learning, in those who use services, whoever we are, it hasn't been used to turning the mirror inside, inward, to look at and value support, but even value lived experience of those of us in the workforce who have it, which are many. We are not a minority, so this is not a minority issue here for lived experience. And there's some research out of UCL, Unit for Stigma Research, if you want to have a look into that. So I think it's an interesting tell, if we can't find mental health difficulties of value and support them on the inside, then what are we really saying to those who use our services who aren't mental health professionals, but there are plenty who are, but who aren't mental health professionals, when they want to co-design things, or patient leadership drives like Dave Gilbert works so hard on? What are we really saying about it? Well, it's a big tell that we're not comfortable, are we, with that? And there needs to be some air between this fitness to practice stuff and competency and mental health difficulties. The main message should always be, it is not a problem to have a mental health problem as a mental health professional, ever. It's just simply not a problem. It doesn't matter in that way. What is important is that we work in compassionate cultures who are able to meet us where we are, where we feel like we're able to reach out, as Chelsea spoke about. And that's even hard because we don't know how things are going to be received. So it's the bravest thing sometimes anyone ever does. The response should be, of course, what do you need? What do you need? It should be that simple. And when you work your way through the system as somebody who's a provider who's broken down on the inside, for example, and you come up against occupational health and HR, lines of management, supervision, rest, going out to rest, and then re-entry, if you choose, back into the scene. What are all those systems like? Because people who are experiencing those are the people as always, who are best placed to snag them because they need snagging. So they're not always best. And the lived experience networks that exist in trusts throughout the UK, some have been around for a while, some are burgeoning, others that there isn't one, find themselves becoming watchdogs almost unwittingly. I wouldn't be surprised, because there's an activist and a kind of an activist energy here, but they find themselves becoming watchdog for their own internal systems within trusts, that aren't quite good enough, and in some cases are a bit illegal. So people have been snagging policies and procedures. I don't know how I'm doing for time. How am I doing for time? I'm all right. Great. Thank you. I often gabber on and overrun and all sorts. But I wanted to come back to a bit about my personal experience, because otherwise I'll go off on one. But when I broke down, I had to leave my job. I lost my flat. I was deep into benefits and overdrafts and all sorts. Whilst I was really poorly, I was looked after by my parents at home, and I had a secondary care assessment, but they didn't feel that I warranted secondary care support, because I already had a therapist that I was seeing. So that was also a bit more complicated than that, but that's the long and the short of it. And it was the most frightening thing ever to kind of walk into the secondary care system as somebody using it, for fear of what they would think of me, and then I was supported essentially through my therapist, GP, primary care. Was on antidepressants for just under 2 years and then came off. I would have taken anything that would have numbed me out, to be honest with you. I don't think I had faith in antidepressants solving any of my problems, but I needed a bit of relief from the pain I was experiencing. And also peer support through Mind was amazing, really amazing. And she was like, "But you're a clinical psychologist. What am I? How can I help?" And I was like, "Okay, we need to start again." Because I really need your help. I need your companionship. I need your allyship. I need you to be with me as another human being who has felt this way. And I need to ditch my profession. And it's interesting that I came out of the mental health scene to recover. I came out of being a clinical psychologist in my mind to recover. And I wasn't sure I wanted back in either. So that's why I campaigned so hard, because I didn't give a shit about what people thought about me. So I've been on benefits for quite some time, and I been supported by my parents, who have been wonderful, and began to kind of grow Integrate as a company, and did some temping work for a long time whilst I was focusing on that as a mission. And now I've just gone back into the NHS for the first time in a long time, with a manager who knows about Integrate and knows my history in that sense. And I'm just on the triage, which is amazing, at UCH, supporting staff. I'm not ready to do one-to-one work yet, but I am very ready and interested, and I really like the triage function. It's a whole thing in itself. It's really busy, and I'm kind of dipping my toes in there, and they're brilliant. And I am obviously running kind of peer mentoring at Integrate, and I love that, every minute of it. I find it incredibly nourishing for me to meet people who I can help navigate this odd path. Or normal path, really. It shouldn't be odd, but it feels odd sometimes. And then kind of wanting to continue getting involved in policy, really, and systems. I'm really interested in systems and organisations and leadership and stuff like that. So we'll see what happens with the one-to-one work. But always one of the things that I and I went through the HCPC as well. I don't know how many people ever do this, but I put myself up to the HCPC before I came back. For one-to-one mentoring, because I was very confident about how I'd done my exits and re-entries and managed my mental health. But as is usual with me, I'm somebody who learns through experience, and that authenticity for me is important. I knew I may be supporting people who may be thinking about HCPC or and everything, and I wanted to understand the system myself. So I found myself having a conversation with them, and before I knew it, they treated it as a self-referral, and I learned a lot about a very litigious adversarial kind of system, whereas case managed while they did an investigation and all this kind of stuff, and sent in reports from mentors and supervisors and things, and they were really supportive. And in the end, actually, what the HCPC wrote back to me, I kind of want to put in my CV because they said, "Well, Natalie's managed this really, really well." But what happened was they didn't have that kind of capacity at that kind of triage, that kind of authority or capacity at triage level to think about how to support people to just check out, is it all right? Am I doing all right? Am I practicing well? Have I left the right things and taken up the right things? And, often people can get that if they go through occupational health or in clinical supervision, if they're still involved with a trust. But I was not involved with anyone. We have plenty of us who are kind of private practitioners as well. So where do they go? There's a massive gap. The British Psychological Society or the ACP don't provide it. So I've been on at them about it. But, how do we help people navigate that fitness to practice path if you do find yourselves on it? And, certainly when it comes to health issues. So there's lots and lots of, there's loads and loads of things to say. I'm going to stop now because I've probably gone on. Have I? Yes. Stop me. I told you. Just say stop.
You never stop anyone, Natalie.
You must stop me because I can go on for hours. It's my favourite subject. So is there any questions?
Yes, there are. Thank you so much for sharing, Natalie, and thank you for that reflection. Thanks. That was really quite powerful. Thank you. I've got a question here from Ben. So Ben is just following on from a question earlier to Chelsea about kind of self-disclosure in the professional setting. So he's asking, how can people be open but keep themselves safe at the same time?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So, we teach on this we're teaching across about 10 DCLIN courses at the moment, and we talk about sharing safely, and sharing is always from a position of privacy for people. You have a right to privacy. Please don't forget this. So if you are sharing, it's you want to think about your motivations, why you're sharing, what you need back from the reason for sharing. So if you're sharing because you're in distress or you need support, then what you need back is a supportive and containing and compassionate response. So that's a particular way of thinking about what you share as well, and who you're sharing to. If you're sharing for big public activism, a bit like I do, then you want to kind of triage your narrative a bit and make sure you're happy with what you're putting out there. I'm kind of used to talking now, so I'm okay with that. If you're thinking about having a first share in your locality or in your own team, you might want to think about who is it who you've noticed, around. Well, we've lost these corridor conversations now. Everything's so virtual, but who do you feel you have an affinity with? Who feels safe to start sharing that stuff with? And sometimes you might not care, actually. You might just say it in a team meeting. I would love to see, in a team meeting or in training, for example, say you're being taught about a particular model for panic or something. I can't, whatever. And you've gone through having some intervention for panic yourself, and you found some aspects of it really useful and some aspects of it completely useless, or there was something that was really not good or whatever. Then why can't we say, as part of our reflection, even in the room in training, when I had that, that was I found that really useful, but that was less helpful, and I wonder if it's something we can think about as we build our competencies going forward, and as we can share with others about really helpful ways of being in the therapeutic relationship, because that was shit or that was really good. It's why shouldn't we be able to build in this kind of experiential knowledge?
That's awesome. Thank you.
I've got a question from Ryan here. As a psychologist, what's your view on mental health diagnosis? And what are some of the challenges of still working in a system that labels people as mentally ill?
Wow. Did Do you have the courage to ever say that on Twitter? It's my immediate response. Yeah. So there are lots and lots of different paradigms about how people understand mental health at the moment. And sometimes I find myself casting my mind forward into 100 years' time and wondering what it would be like for us to look back at in 100 years' time to how people are understanding about mental health now. In terms of integrate mental health, we don't actually take a position on this at all because we're a peer supporting organisation. So however people have come to finding help with their mental health, whether it's through a medical model, diagnosis, narrative, through analytic formulations, systemic work that they've done in a family when they were there, however it is, we would honour absolutely how they've constructed something useful around them. Personally, for me, I was in the longest time in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So when I went to occupational health and they were asking me certain diagnostic questions, I was like, don't have an answer for you. That's not useful. However, I could probably write you a short essay on what's going on with parts of my unconscious that I then got in touch with as certain defences came down and I was able to look at what was really vulnerable behind them. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Natalie. Next question for you. Do you think having too much empathy can be a problem in terms of affecting your own mental health? And I guess maybe practicing as a clinician as well? I think that's the second part of that.
So this is the classic of, does too much empathy mean you over-identify with clients, meaning that you can't see the woods for the trees or something, and then you end up not being able to put together a formulation or run through an intervention in a way that's of most help to the other person, as opposed to potentially parts of yourself. I think, what do I think? I don't think you can have too much empathy. I think that's probably not a useful way of seeing it. Compassion, I like to think of it as, is a warriorship. There's a real strength and thoughtfulness and reflective aspect to compassion. I think that I'll speak from my personal experience. Part of my breakdown happened because one of my clients, it almost felt like it was a single utterance at one point, but it probably was a few things, said something which triggered off something in me that I just hadn't got to yet in my analysis, So that meant that then I started to become full in myself of quite a lot of difficult feelings, which I then acted on quite quickly in terms of talking to supervision, and there was other things going on which led to the final kind of capitulation into breakdown. But I do think it's important, however you do it, that you strive to use reflective spaces as much as you can. It doesn't have to be therapy. I needed therapy. Some other people might need some therapy, but some other people have a spiritual leader that they speak to, or reflective spaces in some other way, through the courses or through the work that they do, to get to know yourself as well as possible. Because in mental health, we're minds working with minds. And I often say there's no stone left unturned, and you're never quite sure what's coming in the room next. So the more that you can know yourself is the more that you can know the other, and have some aspect of a critical distance, some aspect. That doesn't mean that you can't be the most full of empathy for that person. But where there can be a little bit of a struggle is if there's something that's for me was quite big and unresolved, that needed resolving in order to then be able to help people in that area if I wanted to. I could choose to work in a different area of psychology than the one that was triggering me off. But I want to just wrap around that really importantly, that this is, please understand how the psyche works. You can be in analysis for a long time or in therapy for a long time, for example, and your psyche will give up the goods when it's safe and ready. Okay, you can't push that stuff, and you certainly shouldn't bang yourself over the head if you haven't got to an aspect of yourself. Sometimes these are lifelong works and journeys, so we must be very gentle with ourselves and how we think about I thought if I went to analysis before I, started the course, I would be fixed then. And then I'd be like the perfect psychologist because I'd be all. It's not. I've got a lifetime's worth of work to do, and so I should choose carefully as I work as a clinical psychologist what my fits are, and other parts that might be more difficult for me. That's really normal.
I've got a question here. I think it's a rhetorical one, but I'm going to read it out anyway. Why do people think being a clinical psychologist assumes we're immune from mental health problems or can fix our own mental health?
No, I don't know. And I tell you what, I had this thought a couple of years ago, which was if becoming a clinical psychologist did actually immunise you from having mental health difficulties, then we should just set out a global programme, don't you think? But we haven't done that for good reasons. We are humans first, and then we choose this job.
Thank you. Next question for you, Eva. Are there any resources that you would recommend for people this evening who might be struggling with their mental health? And if you wanted, you could just give us a list and then we can put it up later as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got on the Integrate website, there's sources of support page there, and that also includes things about unions. Let's not forget the unions, and also things about employment and work and Equality Act and your rights. So there's some useful links there. I think I just heard that the practitioner health programme has opened up to all health professionals, as well, not just doctors and dentists, but I think that's been a recent move. Also, they are bolstering up staff support teams at the moment because of COVID. But of course, mental health difficulties didn't just happen because of COVID. This is a phase. COVID is a phase, although it's enormous and massive and huge and has absolutely interrupted and decimated some lives around us. So I'm not minimising it, but I'm just saying these were issues before. And what I'm interested in is what's going to happen after COVID's gone, like a bad dream. What's going to happen then? What we're going to come back to? More stigma? Hopefully not.
Yeah. Kirsty asks, how do you cope with your mental health when your work comes home with you?
Oh, have rituals that help you disconnect from the work. I'm living and working in one room at the moment. I'm in a hotel, funnily enough, because my parents got lots of building going on. So there are certain things that I do in order to I've got the word quarantine in my head because of COVID, like quarantine up spaces, just kind of divide up spaces and then finish and move and have a shower and change your clothes and then move to a film or a book or have a walk, go out for a walk or do a hobby or connect with somebody completely outside of mental health. The disconnections are as important as the reconnections every single time. I do understand that. And our work can be compelling. So please also don't bang yourself over the head if you are occasionally taking people home, because people have compelling stories and we're in this because we want to help. So it will impact us, so it's not to be afraid of the impact, but just to understand that there are ways of easing it off. If you're finding it's happening too much and it's overwhelming all the time, use your clinical supervision, because actually possibly something's got projected into you from the work, and it's about helping to kind of ease that out and put that back into the system to leave it at work. Sometimes you need a hand to do that.
Thank you. Here's another question for you from Sarah. Do you disclose your lived experience to clients?
Interesting. Well, so I haven't been working too much with clients over the years since I've got back. I've just got back onto triage. In triage, I find myself doing a lot of normalising when I'm speaking to staff. So I'm trying to say, yes, a lot of us experience that. I know this question came up earlier. If people are interested, Johnny Lovell did a piece of research, which he hasn't published yet, but that you can get the great big kind of PhD that he's done, but he's also got a website where he put the results. He's from the University of York, and he did some research with those who are using mental health services who weren't mental health professionals or health professionals, and also mental health providers, and he replicated it over in Australia, and they came up with themes about sharing in the therapeutic space. So they were looking at all sorts of things from including lived experience, but also where people share hobbies and other aspects, or family or whatever. And actually, in really brief, what was important, what's the most useful sharing was actually of lived experience of mental health difficulties. However, he calls it to make sure role reversal doesn't happen. So to make sure that when you're sharing, I know it's hard to talk about lived experience as a tool because it's such a vibrant, embodied, heartfelt thing, but to make sure that you are using it specifically as a part of your formulation to enable the other. So you're not using it just to, worst case scenario, offload. Yeah, but I don't know anybody who would do that. But, you know, that it's done really thoughtfully in supervision, in reflection as part of the formulation to help the client.
Natalie, I think you said you had to be away at 8, so I just wondered if we could just squeeze in one last question first.
Of course, yeah.
The last one. So I was asking, I think it's really interesting that you say it feels like a vulnerability to hire people with mental health difficulties, similar to my experience. What do you feel makes it easier to share those experiences without focusing on the negatives and highlighting the positives that lived experiences bring?
So, I'm sorry, is that understanding in sharing vulnerability in the context of sharing? If you're sharing in a team, or if is that what it is?
Yeah, I think maybe with whoever's hiring.
Oh, we're hiring. Sorry. Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I disclosed my lived experience at interview for the course, and I also have it all over my CV. Because it obviously makes sense of what I'm doing with Integrate. But I would say, how do you do it as a positive? It's about the value of lived experience. So it's about lived experience seems to punch a hole through, in a way. It punches a hole through systems. It punches a hole through training. It punches a hole through kind of what you read in books and some kind of intellectualized way of coming at mental health. What it does is it's lived experiential knowledge, which has a place even when you're thinking in the ranks of research, you know, qualitative interviews. You're interviewing people who you want to get to know, people who have experience of the phenomena at hand. So it does have a place where it's kind of valued. But lived experience of mental health difficulties, it gives you lived experience of systems, of understanding the impacts of that, understanding how desperately in pain people can feel, and it helps you all the things that Chelsea was saying earlier about being able to empathize, have a warmth, a sense of authenticity, and a sense of being alongside somebody, and also being authentic about who we are in clinical psychology. If you're somebody who's interested in our profession, clinical psychologist, actually being representative of the very people that we work in so many ways that it isn't at the moment, then we are, of course, representative of humanity, because we are humans, which includes sometimes struggling with lived experience of mental health difficulties. So it's a benefit in the sense that you are immediately drawn from the very population that you're going to be working with, and where you've been able to wrap around support and reflection around that, and that sense of personal wisdom that I see that people bring in droves to their work when they've been through stuff, then you're presenting yourself as a more whole integrated being, because we know that when splits and cut-offs happen, it actually weakens an entity. So, you know, intrapsychically or in organizations at large where there's fragmentation, we operate from a weaker position. Where you're able, as a profession, as an organization, or even personally for me in my strivings through the different, I'm in internal family systems therapy at the moment. I've changed my mode after a year off to look at something in a particular way. But, you know, where we strive to bring all those parts of ourselves, intrapsychically as well, into conversation and into relationship, then you are immediately moving from a more integrative and much more robust position. The only issue is acceptance. It's others' acceptance of us, and it's stigma, which we have to just keep bashing away at.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for that, Natalie.
Pleasure.
We normally take a bit of a break now, so I think they're just 2 past. If we can come back about 1/4 past. So just in the meantime, grab some tea, stroke a cat, and we'll see you in at 1/4 past.
If anyone wants to find me, they can contact me in the Integrate Mental Health website, so I'll just put that up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
So much,
Thank
Natalie.
you.
All right, we're back. So put down your tea, put down your cat. We've got like our excellent last speaker, Michelle. If you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah. So hello everybody. I'm Michelle Jameson and I am from Glasgow and also at the University of Glasgow. So a little bit different to previous two speakers and probably to the other speakers in this series. I am not actually a clinical psychologist or a trainee clinical psychologist. I come from a psychology background and I'm technically, well, I'm finishing off my PhD in research. I work with clinical populations, and I think when I get the PhD, I'll technically be called a chartered psychologist. So a very roundabout way to say that I'm still technically a psychologist and still technically work with people, just not called a clinical psychologist. So I'll get a bit into that anyway. Just to make you aware that there's many different ways of working in psychology with clinical populations without being called a clinical psychologist. So, so I suppose I'll start off a wee bit about my background. So I'm Glaswegian, I'm very working class, first generation sort of thing. Everything, first to complete secondary, first to go to college, first to go to university. So born in Glasgow, grew up in quite a deprived area, went to school. Never done very well throughout, especially secondary. I was dealing with a chaotic home life, and that resulted in obviously not being able to concentrate quite a lot. So I actually left school. Well, I go into this story, I might as well. So when I was leaving secondary school, it was actually during the Afghanistan war. And at the time, I hope it's not allowed now, certainly in Scotland, the armed forces recruited in secondary schools. And obviously in the UK, you can sign up, I think, what is it, at 16 with parental consent. So one day, my year got split up. I was friends with a few people who were quite academically up there, intelligent, they were getting grades. They got to go to a talk by Glasgow University, which is the Russell Group University here, and me and some other people, at the time I was in care, I noticed me and sort of the people from that background got taken to the assembly hall, and we sat through recruitment drives for the armed forces, and quite a lot of us signed up on that day. So I was actually in the armed forces, not for very long, because it turned out I wasn't very good at it. So I actually left within a grace period and went to college to train to be a nurse. Done about 2 years of nursing, and basically left because I what age was I? 18, 19. I actually whistle blew on abuse, and it wasn't very well received by the course. So I left nursing and actually was scrolling through clearing places. I was just looking, had no idea what I wanted to do, and I actually seen in a local university. It's called the University of the West of Scotland. It's a post-92 university, I think they class it as. I'll get into this a bit further down in my speech, but it's basically ragged on up here as being the poor person's uni. If you go to UWS and then go on to a Russell Group University, it tends to get made fun of. But basically I've seen that there was a space on a course called Social Sciences with options. I had no idea at that time what Social Sciences was. Accepted the place, went along, and it turned out psychology was one of those options. Took it in first year, undergrad, and the rest was history. Loved psychology. Took it, ended up taking it to single honours to get the BPS accreditation, and by fourth year I was like, I want to be a clinical psychologist, which factors into the story further down the line, and was kind of planning my future with that. So while I was in university, as Chelsea and Natalie, a lot of the themes that they spoke about tonight have come up for me. Yeah, a lot of people who wanted to go into clinical. I remember we got a talk by a clinical psychologist who came in and said, I think at the time, 2014, she said that something like less than 1% of people that do undergrad psychology become clinical psychologists. So of course I was like, well, that's what I'm going to be, because I love challenging myself. So I remember everyone was speaking about trying to get assistant AP posts and what kind of experience they needed to become a clinical psychologist. And what I noticed was that, first of all, it was very low pay. And secondly, I was already working 3 jobs because I was, first of all, supporting myself. I'd also recently become a carer for my father, so supporting a family member. And I also wasn't able to move around as much because of this. And I was also struggling with mental health issues as well. At the time, it was sort of generalised anxiety disorder. So some people went on to do honorary AP posts, and I just had to trundle along while working. I think I was working part-time in a jeweller's, and I was going to uni during the day, and I was also working nights in a care home. So I would not recommend this to anyone. Like, if you're in university, try and, if you can, not work 3 jobs, and certainly not a 8-hour night shift job before exams and stuff, because it doesn't work out very well. But anyway, somehow fell in love with psychology, managed to come out with a first. At the time, didn't know how, what's the word, intrinsic this would be to my career. I just thought I had done really well, like, and somehow it was an absolute shock that I had done this well. But it stood me in good stead, because I ended up thinking that I want to do a master's, and of course masters are very expensive, and I won a scholarship to Glasgow University. And this is where the sort of class consciousness really formed into being for me, which might be a little bit unusual to some, because I do identify as working class. But up until I was like 20, 21, class had always been an issue, but it wasn't an issue to be working class, because everyone else in my sphere of living was working class. Even under my university, it was the working class university. So even everyone in my course related somehow to the working classness. But when I got to Glasgow University, it's a Russell Group university. I can't remember where it ranks on the rankings, and I really should, because they like to email us about that, like at least once a semester. And that's where I finally began to get angry about the class system in the UK. I'd been kind of angry before, but it was that sort of underlying anger. And then I got to Glasgow Uni, and people started saying that I was only there because I got the Poor Person Scholarship, which is technically true, but it's not called the Poor Person Scholarship. It's actually called the Carnegie Cameron Scholarship. But you just, you mouth off, like, you do what you want. I'll just sit here and study and get good grades, I guess. Yeah, so that was sort of the university experience. So that was like very condensed, but that takes us up to 2015, 2016. So obviously tonight we're speaking about that intersection with, I tend to term it poor mental health. I really don't like the illness narrative, and I have thoughts on diagnostic labels, but I suppose we can get into that if we've got time. So I'd always kind of struggled with what had always been termed as generalised anxiety disorder. It had very chaotic upbringing, which sort of lends itself to that. And so we're just at the end of my first master's. I actually took a break because of mental health issues. Ended up in the benefits system, which is quite traumatic in its own. And I decided, why not touching myself a bit more? I'll go back for a second master's. So I actually went back to do a master's by research, which is called an MRes. Won a scholarship for that as well. Went back, thought, got my mental health under control, do the MRes. This gives you a year. I'd also been applying for the clinical psychology doctorates. There's 2 in Scotland, at Glasgow and Edinburgh. Just 2. You think there'd be more now, but no. And so by 2016, I had interviewed at least once. I got an interview after my master's, interviewed for Glasgow. And I remember, for anyone that's been through the interview process, I think I was sitting in front of the NHS board, and one of the questions they asked, it's probably no surprise I did not get in, they asked, what do you see as an issue in clinical psychology in Scotland, I think, and I just kind of said, there's too many middle class white people, and they didn't like that answer. It also didn't help that the majority of the board leaders in Scotland or certainly at the time were middle class white men, so might have just, I really should have read the room before that answer, but at the same time, like, why are you asking this question when you don't want actual answers? People just don't do that. But anyway, if you do go up for interviews this year, like, read the room before you answer. Don't do what I do. Like, please don't. So anyway, went back to do my MRes because by this point I actually really fell in love with research, and I know research is part of clinical psychology. I know they have research streams now, which is good, but I'll come into why I chose a research PhD. So on the masters, and I should have said at the start, so I've always sort of worked with clinical populations. I mostly specialise with what's termed in the literature as quotation marks severe mental illness. So I do a lot of work around psychosis and schizophrenia, and recently the lived experience of this because I also have a psychosis diagnosis and live with that. So that kind of came up in 2017 for me. I was trying to finish my MRes dissertation and apply for PhDs and clinical at the same time. I was sort of spreading my opportunities as wide as I could. And not to go too far into it, I have spoken about this in other online chats. I actually recorded a chat with Natalie, who just spoke before the break, about my journey into psychology as well, and I think that's up on YouTube if anyone is interested as well. So 2017 summer, there was 2 incidents that, looking back now, had a massive impact on what happened, but I basically had what's termed as first episode psychosis, which when you're trying to finish a dissertation and do the clinical applications and PhD rounds isn't it's not the best time to have psychosis, but there we go, life happens. So that happened, and my journey through secondary mental health care is painful. It's very painful. I have spoken about it before in other talks. I'll link to my Twitter and my website where you can find these things, and I know we don't have a lot of time tonight, but some of the themes that come up for me as well that Natalie raised is that when I did try to seek help, first of all, I always had a lot of insight into what was happening, and for people who know anything about psychosis spectrum conditions, traditionally insight isn't part of the experience, but it was for me, so that really hampered help. The second biggest thing was, at this point I was at the end of my second masters, and the doctors kept calling me a psychologist. They kept saying, well, you're a psychologist, you don't know how to help yourself. Or I remember sitting in front of a psychiatrist once I actually accessed psychiatry, and the psychiatrist saying, oh, you probably, like, if you study this, you probably know more about it than me. Yeah, mate, that's not helping. Like, going through psychosis here, you need to do something. Like, don't tell me I need to help myself. You're lucky I've got some insight right now during this appointment. What are you doing? So, unhelpfully, that's been a theme to this day. Secondary mental health services haven't been too great, but at the same time, I'm also fully aware it's massively underfunded, overstretched, but also doesn't help when you're told you're not going to get referred on to therapy because you're a psychologist yourself and you should help yourself, even though I go blue in the face telling them I'm a researcher. I research this condition. It doesn't mean I know how to cure myself. Like, please get a grip. Like, I'm leaving. So that was probably a very whistle stop tour of sort of my background. So where does that take us up to? 2017. Somehow I do not know how I interviewed for several PhDs and got offered positions. So hopefully people sort of know the distinction, but the doctorate in clinical psychology, like the way I've always distinguished the two, doctorate in clinical psychology is applied you come out as an applied practitioner, you can work therapeutically with people. PhD, doctorate is mostly purely research, and you usually come out of it as a chartered psychologist, and you tend to then go into academia. In Scotland, we're seeing more and more people applying to the clinical doctorates who already have PhDs. Certainly when I was interviewing the trainees, all of them in the room that day had PhDs behind them as well, so they were technically double doctors. And I'm just saying they look tired. So I don't know what the demographics are for England, but certainly in Scotland, we're seeing the what's the word I'm looking for? Each application cycle, you're seeing more people with PhDs already behind them, which is a good thing. Like research and research literacy is a really good experience to have if you're interested in clinical psychology. I think a lot of people really focus on getting experience that's applied, and I think research can often be left by the wayside, but there is a whole section of the clinical interviews that's focused on research, and I think a lot of people panic about it. So you can get research experience. I do recommend it, because at the end of the day, in your applied doctorate, you need to do a whole dissertation at the end. It's not as big as a traditional PhD, but it's a big piece of work. Anyway, 2017, I did apply to the clinical doctorate. I think I got an interview for Edinburgh and I turned it down because basically, long story short, I was actively psychotic. I could not, probably couldn't interview if I tried, so I turned it down. Things started easing off a little bit towards the end of 2017, and I interviewed for several PhD positions, and I got a couple in Scotland, and I chose to stay in Scotland just because of caring duties. And at that point I was also in secondary care as well, and I didn't feel it would be the best decision to move too far away. So I chose to stay at Glasgow. So entered my PhD in 2017, and I said at the start, I do work with clinical populations. So my PhD is on the broad topic of what's termed severe mental illness, quotation marks, because I have thoughts on using the word illness when it comes to what is subjective human experience when it comes to mental health. So let's see what I said at the start. I go off on tangents all the time. Anyway, my PhD looks at the role of severe mental illness and the relationship to employment for people in Scotland. But because of COVID, now it's changed to people in England because I can't actually get access to the Scottish data, and now I have to rewrite my whole front end of the literature review to do with England, and that was sort of a crash course in English policy, because all of my research up until now has been in the Scottish context. So that brought us to the PhD life. For anyone wondering, I mean, you probably caught me at a bad time during the PhD, it's been a difficult few months. PhD, I really recommend. I also know several clinical psychologists who would, after their applied doctorate, somehow made the decision to do a PhD afterwards, just because it's such a great research experience. I do highly recommend it for anyone who's interested, but at the same time, if you think, oh, I'm going to do a PhD because that will get me into the clinical doctorate, it also won't do that either. You need to have other reasons to do a PhD. But yeah, so I suppose speaking a little bit about how I live with the label that I do, and doing that's the strange thing, because I live with a psychosis label. Not to get too into it, but my labels have changed a lot depending on what psychiatrist I've seen. Funnily enough, there's quite a bit of research on that if people are interested. But so I live with a psychosis label, and I research psychosis, which I suppose when you think about it is a bit strange. It has actually came up when I've been in psychiatry appointments. At one point, I had a psychiatrist ask if I thought I'd somehow got psychosis because I study psychosis. That's maybe one of the worst things I've had said to me in secondary care. I honestly don't know. Well, his thinking behind it was just so strange. I was actually stunned, and he was like, I mean, do you think maybe if you choose another topic? And I was like, no, I don't think this is the reason for it. Dr. Smith, I honestly, no. So, but we're not talking about the weird things that have happened to me in secondary mental health care today. Yeah, so what have I not touched upon? So I suppose I should really speak about the working classness, because it's actually something that's came up within the past couple of weeks. So I'm about 6 months off of completing the PhD, and obviously I'll be a doctor by the time I hand in the PhD and sit the Viva. I'll be the first one in my family. For me, identifying as working class is a massive part of my identity, and especially as I've came through academia and Russell Group universities, I've held on to that very strongly, and have a lot of anger around working classness and class in psychology. So not just from a professional view, where personally I think the reflective process within applied psychology and other healthcare professions could be improved, but also personally when I've been through secondary mental health care. So I get, as I've said before, I identify as working class. When I have been through secondary mental health care and seen some psychiatrists, psychologists, whatever therapists for treatment, I have personally disengaged from care if they've disclosed they've been middle class. I tend to ask it personally. If I'm there for personal therapy, I usually say, like, I'm Michelle, I'm a research psychologist, I'm very working class. I think in the UK, like, people say there isn't a class issue, but we also can't get away from the class issue. There's all those sort of sneaky questions people can ask to discern your class. Like, I don't know if this is the same for England, but certainly in Glasgow, one way to discern someone's class, like, say I was to bring a partner home, my mum would ask, are their mum and dad still married, and what school did they go to? And from those two questions, she could tell whether their mum and dad had money and whether they were middle class or working class. So it's something that comes up personally, and it also comes up in my work because a lot of my work is centred around austerity. So on to personal thoughts on working with middle class psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists. Personally, quite recently, I have disengaged when I have asked, are you middle class? And they say yes, or there has been some quite traumatic experiences where I've disclosed that, say, struggling with finances, say I couldn't afford heating and it's just been very tactless, and they say, well, just turn your heating on. I have just stopped the therapeutic relationship right there. Personally, I know it's something I do go to therapy every week, and it is something that's come up very recently for me because now I do have a lot of anger around class, and I know it's not going to be helpful if I do go into clinical psychology, because middle class white people are overrepresented, and I struggle massively with it, just because when I have been in secondary mental health care, the majority of people have disclosed they're middle class and have also some way, I hate to use the word re-traumatised, but upset me, while I've also been trying to seek help for quite a serious mental health condition. I realise I've just went off sideways again. This is my problem. Like, I think I'm going to speak very linear, and then I'm like, whoosh, story time. So let's get back on track. So yeah, there's I heard the little beeping notification, so I'm sure there's questions around that. Yeah, so I'm trying to think what else I have not covered. I think I've basically covered everything. For anyone interested, I do have thoughts around the reflective teaching process that's not only taught to clinical psychologists but medical professionals and everything else. Personally, now I am at the end of my PhD. I have had some time to develop training around reflections for practitioners that I'm hoping to take forward in my career. Oh, and I should have said, because I said at the start, why I chose a PhD over clinical psychology. Long story short, I am now very disillusioned with clinical psychology, but positive out of that is I have moved into research, and hopefully this weird jumble of a talk tonight will let a lot of you know that your journey through psychology isn't linear. You also don't need to be a clinical psychologist to still be involved with clinical populations, and research is 100% good, because without the research as a clinical psychologist you could not put anything into practice, because you need a research basis to do that. So it's people like me that do that research. And like Natalie especially said, I'm also very interested in policy implementation, and very recently I've just became comfortable disclosing my lived experience. I just used to say mental health condition. It's only been recently I've disclosed it as a psychosis spectrum condition. And there is still a lot of stigma in the profession, certainly within clinical psychology, but even just academia at large. Even though I don't work therapeutically, my fitness to practice has been called into question. It is a very scary thing to disclose that you hear voices, just because people react so viscerally. And I'm sorry, my Glaswegian accent really murders some words. So yeah, there's just so much tangled up in it that it would take more than tonight to work through it. And I had just looked at the time, and I think I will wrap it up there, because otherwise I'll just go off into another story and we'll be here like far too long. So hopefully I have covered everything that people want to hear, and at least we have like 15 minutes for questions. So yeah, I'll stop. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that, Michelle. We got a question here from Mirabai. They're saying that story about the kind of class division at school makes her really angry.
Mm-hmm.
And just how politically active can you be as a psychologist is what they're asking. So
what was that? How politically active?
How politically active can you be as a psychologist?
Personally, I believe that I know up until very recently, the sort of status quo was not to be politically neutral, but it certainly is changing. And there are several branches now across the UK, several different branches in England. I think it's just one branch in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Used to be called the Psychologists Against Austerity. They're now called Psychologists for Social Change, and they really sort of coalesce the thought that you can be politically active and engaged as any sort of psychologist. I don't think we can, I don't work therapeutically with people, even though I do engage with clinical population groups. I don't think you can 100% remove yourself from that, because it also makes up who you are as a person, especially if you're someone who's not traditionally been visible in the profession. You can't just separate yourself from that, and I think it's a negative thing that is sometimes asked of practitioners and researchers. So I 100% believe you can be active. Yes.
Thank you so much for that, Michelle. Another question here for you from Rosanna. How do you channel your frustrations with services?
My frustration with services. I mean, I'm surprised tonight I haven't actually swore. I'm quite sweary. So sorry. Frustration with services. So luckily enough, I can speak about it in my research. It's usually very scathing in my research. I also have a creative practice, so I write a lot of poetry, do a lot of photography, things like that. It can also come out as that, and I'm also on Twitter. I'll leave my handle below, but if you enjoyed tonight, this is basically just an in-person preview of what I'm like on Twitter. I vent a lot about lived experience on Twitter. Yes, but this is why you should pay more attention to people with lived experience, because you need to understand their experiences, and in some ways, I've spoken about this before on other podcasts and things, in some ways I'm seen as slightly more palatable because I am, quotation marks, a psychologist in whatever way that person sees me, and that makes me palatable even though I have a psychosis spectrum condition. So I have been invited a lot for guest lectures and speeches and stuff, because they think that I'll be this nice package, and still sort of toe the party line of psychology, when really I'm like, F Tories, that kind of like. I tend not to get invited back to places quite a lot of the time, after that first speech. So, yeah. Yes, and sorry, that was another tangent to that question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know you've mentioned your Twitter. Someone's just asking, have you got a blog?
I've got a website. So I'll type it all in the chat as well. And if anyone follows the Class in Psych account on Twitter, I'll sort of retweet that sort of stuff so you can find me, but I'll leave it in the chat. So yeah, I do have stuff online if anyone's interested in this weird rant.
Kirsty's asking, if you could give one piece of advice to working class undergraduates, what would it be?
One piece of advice to working class graduates: find other working class people to support you. Ignore the middle class people insulting you, or tell them to go away. That's basically, when I moved from the undergrad to the Russell Group University, I got really, really down by people talking about their, like, the university and how it wasn't up to much, even though my undergrad psychology degree was accredited by the BPS like everyone else. Or they would speak about all their roles and things like that. So this is so cliche, but try and not compare yourself, because really journeys aren't linear. Sort of find other working class people, because please get angry in that class solidarity. Form some sort of class solidarity and get angry together, because it will help you through. And I suppose I should put another piece of helpful advice in there, but I can't actually think of any because I'm angry like 90% of the time.
Another question for you. Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought there. Yeah. Were there any challenges that you experienced when researching psychosis because of your diagnosis? And if so, what were the challenges?
Yeah, so this is something that even came up for me as recently as yesterday. Researching psychosis as someone that lives with psychosis is very upsetting, very upsetting. I spend a lot of time going through it in therapy. I spend a lot of time crying sometimes, especially the literature around employment, because that is my research area, especially a lot of the older literature that basically says once you have this diagnosis, you're effed, like you're done, you're never going to have any great quality of life, you're never going to have a relationship or get a job, and it's very upsetting to read that, but at the same time it's also part of my research. So at the same time, that upset and angriness factors into my research, because actually, right, even though my PhD is purely quantitative, I have interwoven reflexivity, so I've interwoven autoethnography throughout the quantitative piece. My supervisors aren't that keen on it, but it's getting handed down anyway. And yes, also the value of having lived experience people in any of these roles as well. But yes, I don't know how to put a positive spin on that, just because it has been something I've been struggling with up until just like yesterday. It comes up every so often, and it is particularly upsetting. But hopefully my research will get published, and someone maybe with the same condition as me will read it, and it won't make them cry. So cross your fingers for that.
Yeah, we've got a question from Laura. Do you find, I think you've partially kind of answered this, but do you find any barriers of being working class and networking with researchers? She says she's found it hard to engage with them, as she feels automatically the less cleverest in the room.
Yes, so I could speak about this all night, but I won't. So basically, being working class in the academia, whether you're on the applied doctorate or not, there is the what's called it, like the unwritten curriculum or reading between the lines. So people who are middle class or do have a family who've been to university, They just seem to know the score. They seem to know what to do. They seem to know who to talk to. They always seem to get the jobs. And I don't have that. Like, my family don't have any networks. I often joke when I do give talks. I also mentor some people as well on the side. When I give any sort of advice around networking, I always laugh and say, well, like, the only network my family had was to, like, the local prison. Like, that's not going to help me get a job after academia. Like, so, and it's just so frustrating because especially in research and academia, they say it's not like this anymore, but it partly is, unfortunately. It is, like, who you know, like, who to contact, and it's very frustrating. So that's why I encourage all the working class people to team up together, because if there's enough of us, they can't really take us down. Like, so just find everybody. Yes.
Thank you.
I'm also having a look at the questions myself. Sorry, Julie, I interrupted you.
No, it's fine. I was going to say that kind of leads nicely into this next question about, do you think it's possible to channel your frustration around class into your work in a positive way?
Yes, it's something I've done previously. The Emira's dissertation that I'd done during the first episode of Psychosis, I actually finished that off. That was an exploration into the impact of benefit sanctions in Glasgow for people living with schizophrenia. And I channeled a lot of that class anger into that because I had to be quite reflexive during it. And if anyone is interested in that, I did actually publish it last year, and I've got a free ebook copy. So people, if you're interested in how to channel class anger into research, I have, Ben has it, Ben's on the screen with it. If anyone is interested, I can certainly send it to them. Personally, I think it's a good example of how to channel rage into research, and for it to be published so people can't accuse you of being the angry lefty.
I think this might be the last question, but what are some of your thoughts about the reflective process in clinical psychology?
Oh, so many thoughts, so little time. So I also actually offer the resources I have developed as an academic around reflection on a sliding scale from 0 to just donation-based. And if anybody follows me on Twitter, I'm happy to answer questions and things. Basically, it's the same in other healthcare professions that I've been in. Like, I also trained as a nurse before moving to psychology, before registering. Basically, to sum it up, reflective practices that I've seen in the Scottish courses, at least, sort of centre around the models like Gibbs model and things like that, which personally I think still stops you from being 100% reflective, because you're technically not actively engaging in reflexivity, which is different to reflection. And even following that process can hamper that. You're still not examining your biases and things like that. So I do think it needs to be overhauled, and it's something I hope to do as an academic. But I know I've not got enough time here tonight to go into it. But if anyone is interested, get in touch with me, and I can show you what it means. And yeah, basically the way I do that is I will send you lots of creative writing prompts that are based around horror movies to make you reflect. So if that's anyone's jam, get in touch. Sorry for tonight.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Michelle. I can't see any more questions unless I've completely missed.
Yeah, we might actually finish on time.
Oh, the horror. Oh, thank you so much for that, Michelle. It's been amazing just hearing you speak, and none of it was there wasn't any tangent. All of it just kind of added to your story, and your journey so far. So thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for giving up your evening as well. I've certainly learned so much, and I think so many people have as well, judging by the comment. People are really kind of appreciative of what you said. A lot of people can relate. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and I'll catch up on everyone's comments just now as well. Oh, and I was going to put my details, so I'll type them in the chat just now.
Thank you.
Michelle, can I also say quickly, I thought I was the only one that got brought off into a room and tried to
No!
by the army. They were like, "You're not gonna get 3 sick form. Come on, come to Afghanistan."
Yeah, free holiday. You'll get free holidays, and it's the most money you'll ever learn. Who wants student loans? Come and sign up to the army during the period of time where they didn't even have proper equipment.
And that was literally their pitch, was like,
yeah,
why
it was
loans when you can go on a free holiday to the Middle East? Like, come on.
So
And they gave us all free mouse pads. We had the whole uni library, or the uni college library, all had like join the army mouse pads.
We didn't get them, so you were lucky.
They obviously saw. They obviously felt able to spend that 8p on, mouse pads for us all. So good. Thank you so much. That was really, really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've just put my info in the chat for people.
Fab. Well, guys, will we leave it there for this evening?
Yeah, I think that's it for this time.
Guys, thank you all so much for being involved and for being here. Just to plug our own Twitter, because we might as well. We are Class Clin on Twitter, and you can follow some of the discussion from this evening if you look at the Class Clin Psych hashtag on Twitter also. But thank you all very much. And thank you to Julie and Munzar for being fantastic hosts, as always.
Our pleasure, thank you. And there's a feedback as well in the comment that Will's just posted. Thank you. If you could all fill that in, that'd be amazing.
Fab.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.